Welcome to another Unwinding with Fiber and Fabric. In just a week's time, we will start Tour de Fleece 2024. And as I mentioned in my last video, we will have a lot of fiber content rather than necessarily fabric content for the next few weeks. But before diving totally into the concept of spinning and fiber, I thought I would spend a little bit of time talking about the dye processes that I use. Today we'll be discussing a heavy amount of wool dyes because I've been dyeing wool for spinning. But my techniques and my process has a tendency to be similar regardless of whatever I'm dyeing, whether it's fabric or fiber. I have a rather unorthodox method of dyeing. If you are an indie dyer, if you purchase from indie dyers, you may be aware of the desire to be able to reproduce the results. But an indie dyer versus a commercial dyer, even if they have a recipe, even if they follow strict process, they're working with small batches rather than large batches. Knitters and crocheters and weavers out there, you may be very well aware that when you're buying a sweater's quantity or a blanket's worth of fiber, you are wanting to make sure the dye lot, the grouping, is the same from skein to skein. Because even if the recipe for that dye and that dye process is the same, there can be variations between batch to batch. When we start getting into indie dyeing of yarn, especially of fiber, you will get an increased potential for variation. Mainly because we are not using mechanical means to distribute the dye. And sometimes we are, like in the case of indie yarn dyers, we are dyeing the yarn after it is spun. And we are thereby putting the dye on an item, a fiber that has twist already in it. And every bit of twist can act as a bit of a resist. It is possible to have the dye not want to get into all the nooks and crannies once there is the twist in place. As opposed to if you are dyeing fiber and the fiber is opened up completely, it is much easier to get an even dye. In a large dye bath, it's much easier to get an even spread of the dye. Now, for those of you who have never done dyeing before, many of you may have done what's called tie-dyeing of shirts and clothing items. In the process of tie-dyeing, the ties, the elastics or string ties that you use, crimp together and bind around the fibers and actually act as a resist, preventing the dye from soaking completely in, thereby leaving maybe white or undyed areas. For those of you that have researched a little bit more or maybe played with different fabrics, you know that there is something called a batik. A batik is another type of dyeing in which you get a certain type of effect. One of the big characteristics of traditional batik type fibers is that there will be resist, whether it is resist from one of the most traditional ways is adding a wax resist. The wax temporarily sits and permeates on the fiber to prevent, or the fabric in this case, to prevent the dye from being absorbed by the fiber. Other ways, like with the tie-dye, or I believe it's, why am I thinking, I think the word is shibori. I have quilting terms and dyeing terms floating around in my head at the moment. But the idea of running a thread through, or folding and gathering up the fiber, and that thread and the tightness of the fiber can act as a resist. Folding up the fabric and binding it tight like a tie-dye causes the resist. There's a number of different ways we can create a dye resist. The two most common traditionally are wax and are threads. Okay, so we've talked about how fibers and fabrics can either be dyed to have an even spread, or we can intentionally have it to where we will have an undyed portion or uneven spread of the dye. And this is where dyeing my wool, my ways of dyeing, comes into being a little bit on the unique side. Now, there are so many ways to dye fabric. There are so many ways to have fun with playing with dye. But at the heart of all dye processes is what kind of dye are you using, and that is based on what kind of fiber are you dyeing. For instance, the cotton shirt that I have on, I have dyed, I've over dyed it. So it's a print, and I've put it in a bath to take up some dye, but you notice the big white areas. When I did this shirt, the only resist was the wrinkles. I took the pre-soaked fabric, in this case, soaked in a soda ash. I took the pre-soaked fabric and I scrunched it all up into a ball, and then I put the dye on it. And everywhere that was really tightly scrunched, the dye didn't penetrate. So that scrunching method, no ties involved, no other resist involved, that scrunching method offered me the ability to put the dye on and have it come out an uneven dye. And when I dye my wool, I do the same thing. Whether it is a prepared, combed, roving, or in the case of the dyes for this year's Tour de Fleece, scoured wool, regardless of the wool fibers that I'm doing, and the same can hold true with cotton fibers, but I'm going to shift from talking about cotton over to talking about wool, I think, going forward. Because while the process is the same, the scrunching it together, pouring on the dye, and allowing there to be dye unevenly distributed based on how it's scrunched together. The dyes that I use when I'm using wool are, in my mind, an easier type of dye. They are an acid dye versus, in the case of my cottons and stuff, I use a fiber reactive dye. In the cases of the cottons, and it's cotton fiber or cotton shirts, cotton fabric, there's a chemical reaction. I soak the item, there's a chemical reaction when the soda ash and the dye with a reactive chemical in it, when they meet. And it's that reaction with in either time or heat, okay, because either one can work, that sets the dye. But when we move over into wool, natural animal fibers, as opposed to natural plant-based fibers, when we move over to wool, and with the exception also nylon is a different a different substance into itself, but nylon also will absorb dyes in the wool dyeing process. Don't ask me why, I don't know the science of it. But when we look at wools, when we look at animal fibers, alpaca, sheep, human hair, the nature of the fiber allows for an easier dye process. You don't need to have the same kind of chemical reaction that you need with a plant-based fiber. What you need is acid. And in this case, I'm talking about a citric acid, a vinegar acid, in many cases, yeah, basically a food safe acid. So that's why so many people like dabbling with dyeing their fiber, their wool, with Kool-Aid or drinks like Kool-Aid, the unsweetened. You don't need the sugar. Because the Kool-Aid has dye powders and it has acid. And the two of them coming together give you a wonderful staining property. Now, when we actually purchase dyes designed for dyeing fiber, we're getting more variety of color. We're getting more intensity oftentimes, more controlled, and in some cases, more light fast, meaning it won't fade in light compared to Kool-Aid. But the principles when it comes to dyeing wool are pretty much the same. You can use, actually, that's the interesting thing about the wool. A lot of different pigments can be used to dye your wool. Acid being the key component to the most prevalent dyes that we have out there. Safe dyes for both ourselves, the environment. They are much more on the safe side. The only caution we have to do when we are working with these wonderful dye powders, and that's what I use, is a dye powder as opposed to liquids. When we're using these dye powders, we must remember that inhaling them, even little bits, is not the best thing for us. So we want to take a precaution with the fine powder. But otherwise, we're talking about really safe dyes. Okay, so we take and make up, and by the way, I will put in the link below some of the places that I buy my dyes. There's one on the West Coast, there's one on the East Coast. I've used both. Today, the dyes that I've used are all from Pro Chemical and Dye here on the East Coast. But I also have quite a number of dyes from Dharma Trading on the West Coast. There, and that's where I get the majority of my dyes. There are other dye distributors and sellers out there who, especially when dealing with cotton, with plant fiber dyes, who may be closer to your location and you can save money on shipping. And that's the thing to keep in mind. Look for, this is a kind of situation where there's a real advantage for you to purchase as close to you as possible, oftentimes because the shipping can get expensive when you're buying dyes, simply because the weight sometimes, the quantity, the boxing. So I will put the links to some of the ones that I know in the description below, but today's fibers have all been dyed with dyes from Pro Chemical and Dye. And I have put, and I know I have a picture up here of my dyes in my little pots. I have put a short reel together on Instagram that says all the, have I done the colors? I don't know if I've done, I'm thinking, I'm not sure I actually have done a reel of my fibers. I plan to, but I have put all of the information on Ravelry, all of the individual stash with their color names. If you go on Ravelry, Pioneer Lady, you can find my color information. But today's not so much about the specific colors, is how I am doing the process. Because I've talked about the resist that comes from scrunching it up, whether it's the cotton, whether it's fabric, whether it's wool, whether it's, fiber or roving. By scrunching it up when it's wet and putting the dye on it, you can get that kind of resist. And that means every batch is a little bit unique. But when it comes to wool, sheep's wool specifically, there's another factor that comes into play as to how to get a more mottled overall dye. And if you look, you'll see it's not an even color absorption all the way. You have dark areas, you have light areas. And the key to this is in two parts. One, I do try to wash out the majority of my lanolin, but I can feel that there's still a little bit of lanolin in this fiber. Where there is lanolin, the lanolin, a waxy substance, can act as a little bit of a resist to the absorption of the dye. Additionally, where you have dry, brittle tips, and sometimes this will be a brittle tip, and that's actually pretty strong. The dry tips can sometimes absorb a whole lot more color than the rest, but the big resist, much like with tie-dye, is the lock structure. If you notice, I haven't opened up my locks. And the locks absorb dye differently. In the case of where it's all clumped together, okay, the stuff that's on the outside got darker. The stuff that's on the inside of a clump stays lighter. So how much lanolin removed can affect it because it's a wax resist. Whether or not the locks are opened, fluffed up before we dye or not, can create a resist. And I love this effect because if you notice, this one lock of fiber, it's got a lot of different color variation. Same dye, one dye bath, but look at all the color variation. And that is what I like to do. I really, really like having my fiber dyed when it's in a closed lock rather than an open, fluffy fiber. Now, let me show you an example of very similar. In fact, it may even be the exhaust. I'll explain that term in just a minute, of something like that. This is merino roving that I put in the leftover dye from a dye bath, one of the red dye baths. Do you see how much more evenly dyed that fiber is? Because it was an more open, fluffy, carded fiber. Oops. Dropping it on the ground. So, the intensity is not as strong because it's the leftover. But do you see how it is a much more even dye? So if you want an even distribution of your dye, you want to open up, you want to pre-card, prepare, open up your fibers. But if you want all those slight color variations, leave them in the lock. That's why I love it. Now, when the fiber has been processed and combed, and I have been using my combs, look at that. Now, you can still see the color variation. It's much more even now because I have opened it all up. But look at the color. You can still see the color variation. And that will translate into your spun yarn. And what it will create is a depth of color rather than a solid, flat color. And that's the reason I like to do it this way. So, when I dye, as you see in the picture, I pre-make up all the dyes in their own little pots, but I put the fiber in their own containers. Now, I am currently using in this picture the leftover containers from frozen lasagnas. These are all containers that have a large individual type portion frozen lasagnas. They're wonderful. It's a great way of reusing something that otherwise would just go into the trash or recycle. I will reuse them. If they get stained from the dyeing process, I'll use them in paint. I use them in a ton of different craft ways. You can use mason jars. I've done a lot of dyeing in mason jars. You can use glass is wonderful because it is really easy to get the dye really cleaned out of it. So I always use something that is microwavable safe, because when I'm doing these small batches, I will be microwaving them. They're in their individual little pot. They will go into the microwave for 1 minute to 2 minutes. And then again, I'll go through and do all of them, and then again, another round. The goal here is to have them reach a certain temperature and then let them cool down naturally. They should, if you don't overuse your dye powder, they will absorb all of the dye, and all you'll be left with is a vinegar water, a fairly clear vinegar water. Now, some colors are really tough to exhaust, and this time around, and exhaust means to use it all up. This time around, I ended up having a number of colors that I probably put too much dye powder in for the 1 ounce of each thing. I have a whole bag. I took a 4-ounce braid of merino roving. I tore it into sections and I shoved them in the leftover dyes. Some of the dyes were completely exhausted, which is why I really don't have any yellows in here. Some of the dyes needed a little bit more effort. So that was exhaust number 1. 3 of my dyes were really intense and just did not want to stop being color. And so I grabbed some more fiber. Now, these have now been, this fiber was just scoured, thrown in, dyed, and I've now carded it into this fluffy, wonderful state. Okay? So these dyes, because they just didn't want to stop. This one especially just really went on forever. I think this was the Brilliant Violet. And oh my goodness, that really held on. So I always like to have some extra fiber on hand when I'm doing my dye process so that I can exhaust my dye baths. And then I have other just fun, more pastel versions of my intense color. So let's see. I've talked about the exhaust. I've talked about my little pots that I use. I've talked about how I love dyeing locks of fiber rather than opened up fiber. I've done both. When I'm dyeing roving, I tend to dye roving much like indie dyers for yarn, and I'll drizzle it on. And I have videos that you can check in my playlists on my channel. I'll drizzle the color on, and by speckling it, I'll get a really wonderful palette of colors in a roving. But when it comes to my favorite part of dyeing, it really is, and this, by the way, is one of my favorite colors to do. When I started out dyeing fiber, I was using the Kool-Aid, and I loved black cherry. And this reminds me of the black cherry. The difference is, if I sniff this, it doesn't really smell like black cherry. Strangely enough, it does smell a little bit like vinegar, so it is kind of reminiscent of that black cherry. And so I dyed this. Once the dye bath, once it had cooled, it had soaked up the dye that it was going to soak up, I then very carefully rinsed it. And when I say carefully, I mean I very carefully rinsed it. I filled up a bowl. I put the fiber in. I squished it gently, drained the water off, and repeated to get rid of any or as much of the excess dye as I could, because there will always be a little bit that might come off. I had a couple colors that completely exhausted and no colors ever bled, nothing. They were very easy. That is getting the amount of dye to fiber really spot on. And that seldom ever happens for me. You can get very specific with this. You can get scales. You can weigh your fiber. You can weigh your dye. You can do the math. I tend to throw all that out the window and just I play. And then I keep extra fiber on hand so that I can exhaust as much of the extra dye. So once it is cooled, once it is rinsed, then I lay it out. I use clothing racks in the past, and I may try to find some photos to be able to put in here. In the past, I've used a couple different methods of drying. So I have drying racks that I use binder clips and clip old towels to. So have a tall rack, I clip towels so that there's a flat surface on every layer, and I can spread out my fiber. If you do not have a drying rack, or if you are insane like I am and do way too much dyeing and you run out of space with your drying rack, another way to do this is take a standard laundry basket, plastic laundry basket, put a towel over it and binder clip the towel to the edge of the laundry basket. By doing this, what you create is airflow under it, and that fiber really can dry. You can put a fan next to it to make more air circulation. But boy, I've had, in my house in Colorado, I had the whole entire living room covered in drying racks and laundry baskets. And the wonderful thing about laundry baskets is laundry baskets are stackable. So if you really have a lot of fleece that you need to wash, investing in a bunch of just simple stackable laundry baskets, binder clips, and inexpensive thrift store towels. So I then put out the fiber, I let it dry, I make sure to turn it over throughout the day, it usually takes about 24 hours, depending on how hot it is and how much fan air is moving around. In the winter in Colorado, if I did this, all I had to do is take the drying rack into the bathroom, and the heat from the central heating would dry it out overnight. Once it's dry, that's when I can start to process it. Now, that's actually what I wanted to, after talking about my dyes, that means I'm trying to remember if I've forgotten any of. So I've talked about the resist, I've talked about my favorite way of dyeing, which is random. It's like leaving it in the lock. And by the way, when leaving in the lock and when you're dyeing fibers, it may look a little bit, this fiber that I dyed was actually very forgiving. This could handle, it didn't look like it was going to felt or whatever. But when I was doing this fiber looked a little more maybe felted. Some fibers may look a little matted when it's done. The air that's in the fluffy roving will be gone. If I pull out here, if you see that it looks compressed, okay? Now in something that's already been carded or combed, see, it's very kind of compressed. Easiest thing to do is just start popping it open like this. Just opening up, reopening up the fibers. Because when it's compressed from the washing or the dyeing process, it's not as easy to spin. You want it open and fluffy. And this is something that I do with my roving anyhow. If it's been sitting in a bag or sitting in a bin for too long, just open up the fibers, fluff them up, okay? You can also tear off a section, and I've done this in my 2020 Tour de Fleece. You can, which I've posted those videos again, you can strip off pieces and spin it like that. But most of the time I just refluff it and it's ready to go. Now, if the fiber, like this one, it hadn't been carded or combed, it was just from the lock. So in this case, I used my hand cards, okay? And I wanted to mention those. Okay, you are, that's this one, okay. I have little tags I have to make sure to keep because they tell me what the fiber are. So I had a question about someone asking about, they had some fiber that it was alpaca. It had been drum carded, but it had become compressed. The bat had become compressed. It wasn't going to be as easy to spin. It's, I could tell from how it's been drum carded or how it's been prepared that all the locks hadn't necessarily really opened up. There were still evidence of locks. So if you don't have hand carders and If all you're doing is re-energizing other fiber, a roving can be re-energized just as I showed by fluffing it up, okay? That's all it takes. Sometimes a well-prepared bat can have the same thing. But if you have fiber that you can still see the lock structure, but it's somewhat carded, it's somewhat, you know, it's kind of, you're not really sure. Dog and cat slicker brushes. And these, there's actually smaller. I have one that's half this size. You don't need anything really all that big. You just need something that allows you, let me pull this fiber, to drag the fibers a little bit over the teeth, okay? And then fluff. All I'm doing now is I'm putting the air back into a compressed fiber. And if it has little tiny locks, especially something like alpaca, this works really well because you don't need anything too heavy duty. You can be, what you lose in, I should say, these are much more efficient, but what you lose in size, you gain in, you can in precise. And sometimes, especially with your delicate fibers, you don't want to overwork them. It's just a matter of opening up and getting some air back into your fiber so they can more easily spin. So slicker brushes, they can also be held just like this, and I will show you. Now, carders and carding cloth, the wire, okay, this is a stiffer gauge wire than this, all right? So these are definitely more efficient, but, and then there is a thing called a flicker brush, which will look a lot like this, has a smaller head like this, okay, but maybe a longer handle, stiffer bristles, but you use it to flick open the tips of your fiber. And it is just a matter of pressing down on the tips and running them out. And now, do you see? And I'll come down here on the cut end and I will press and open, press and open. And that, whoops, pull it off, opens up your fibers and you can spin from that. That, in a big pile, is a cloud of fiber. And so you can spin from this opened up fluffy lock. So it's like spinning from the lock because I only have one lock, but if I make a whole bowl full of this and I just grab from the bowl, then it's a cloud of fiber. I love the fact that people ask, what is, spinning from the cloud? It's the most watched video of all my videos, I think. Cloud of fiber is just a pile. I have one right here. A pile of fiber. So now in this case, this is a pile of fiber. I have combed it with these boys. All right. And if I'm very careful, there's my combed. It's been pulled off the combs and the fibers are all lined up. So this would be, if I put a bunch of these together, it'd be what we run into, a combed top. Okay. But if I just take this pile of fiber and I don't pull out a strand at a time, but just grab and spin and let the spinning come out of, just come out of this pile, then what I end up having is what is more of a cloud. This is going to be spun from the strips, not from the cloud, because I actually do want to have a bit of a worsted spun yarn. Okay, I know I've been kind of all over the place. I wanted to show my little test spin. For those of you who haven't seen, my goal with all of this fiber, that all of my dyed fiber, is to produce that type of fiber, of yarn. It's going to be going into my stash of embroidery yarns. So I wanted some wool. So that's what that's going to be. But I just really wanted to And I couldn't come over here without talking about slicker brushes and carders and combs. These are wonderful to have, but you can really get away with this. You can, if you're doing a fleece, you really can get away with just opening it up. And I guess I should show you that, because if I take, all right, this lock, I can open it up with my fingers and pick it apart with my fingers, just like this. Just like this. And I can spin it. The only reason I am not doing that this year, and that I am using these combs, is because I am trying to produce a very, very thin, consistent, no slubs yarn for embroidery. And because of that, I need to comb out all the neps. I need to comb out all the debris, all the shortcuts. And I have that much combing waste. Now, the name is a misnomer in this case. It is not going to be wasted. I will take this fiber, all of these, see, these short little second cuts. I will take that. I will take the stuff that did not comb out. It's all short. It's, you know, all Mod Podge. You know, there's a little bit of debris. I pick out the debris. I will take that over to my carders, and I will fill up a hand card. And so all my combing waste is going to be carded. And then it can be spun. So that is why I have a whole bag of carding or combing waste that will actually be used in the carding process. Sometimes the process will produce some waste that is not going to be spun up into something. And I usually try to find a way to recycle it. If I didn't want to spin this, if I just was like, nope, I'm good, I would use that as stuffing in some of my crocheted little animals. So I try not to have any waste. What little waste I do end up having goes into my compost heap. So while I am not very structured in my dyeing process, in my fiber preparation process, I do try to be as environmentally friendly, as honorable to the animals that are creating the fiber, to the process. I want to embrace all of it and use it to its best ability. That doesn't mean I have to use everything, but I do need to think about how I'm using it. So I try to exhaust my dye baths. I try to use things that are safer. And yes, there is a lot of things. If you get into looking at this, there's a lot of things that people can say, well, this has a problem or this has a problem. We try to reduce our footprints. We try to reduce our impact, and yet still have a quality of life, still have a quality of craft. And that is what I have been doing, whether it's from reusing the takeout containers, because that's another great source for the little tiny stackable dishes, is takeout containers, especially in the United States, where most of the takeout containers are plastic of some sort, and in some cases, plastic that I can't even recycle. So I'm always trying to find a way to use again, to reuse, to repurpose the things that come into my home. And crafting is one way I do it. Dyeing up my fibers is a way to use them. All right, well, this has been an episode longer than I expected on my dyeing process, whether it's from shirts to fiber. I have to tell you, It is, and going back to my beautiful fiber here, I love playing with color. I love the spinning with color. I love dyeing the color. It is a fun process, and it can be done safely. It can be done with joy and simplicity, and it can switch up a little bit some of what you do. So I hope it's helped you maybe demystify it, if nothing else, the way I do it. There are lots of instructions out there. The number one resource I suggest anybody looking into doing dyeing, fabric or fiber, is to find a good company that sells the dyes, because they will have information sheets on every one of their dyes, and it will tell you how to use them. Pro Chemical and Dye has some of the best downloadable instruction sheets I've run into. And if we're working with acid dyes, we're working with acid dyes. So if you decide to do this, just go to the sources. If you buy your dyes from someone who doesn't supply instructions, look up companies that do. And then the last thing I'll say on this is we've all, at some point or another, if we are people who dye fabrics and fibers, at some point or another, we have all dabbled probably with the store-bought, mass-produced, dye anything under the sun dyes. We've all played around with Kool-Aid, potentially, and I know it's a general sweeping comment, but when you take the time to actually get yourself, and you can get a sampler kit of multiple colors to play around with the process, it can be a lot of fun. Do your research, look up the companies, figure out if it's something you want to try, and if it's not, then find somebody that wants to take the dyes off your hand. But I love it. I wish there was a chance for me to do more of it, but I dye it, then I have to do something with it. And I always feel like I need to use the things that I've made. I need to finish the projects that I've started a little bit. But here is my dyes. Here's my dyed fiber. I will see you next week for Tour de Fleece, in which time I will start spinning up this beautiful dye. Oh, and yes, there is one last thing. So if you follow to the end, just a tip, anyone, and this is for any of you that are spinning with hand-dyed fibers as opposed to commercial dyed fibers. All that lanolin, the dye that's attached to the lanolin, that lanolin is going to come off, especially if it gets dry. There is dirt still in this fiber because I'm washing it and being careful. As you're spinning, even if the dye is exhausted, you might start finding that your hands are changing colors. You may find that when you blow your nose, the dye has traveled. Don't worry. When you are done, rinse your yarn in a vinegar solution. You can always try to reset the dye. A lot of that, though, if it's dyed properly, what you're really only getting off isn't an improper dye. It's the fact that the lanolin and the dirt and all of the things that the fiber may have still had in it, if you're using a fleece rather than a commercially prepared roving, all of that stuff that is going, it's not supposed to be in there, starts to come out in the dyeing process, and it gets on stuff. So drop cloth under your spinning wheel, wash your hands, and try not to worry. It's part of the process of working with animal fibers is no matter how you try to clean them, there will always be potential for a little bit of vegetable matter, lanolin, and dust. It's just a matter of then washing it out once the yarn is spun, because the yarn is more stable than the fiber is. less likely to felt. All right, that's my tip. I'm glad that you joined me for another Unwinding with Fiber and Fabric. If you made it to this point of the video, thank you so very much. And we will see you next week with the beginning of Tour de Fleece. Until then, bye-bye.